presentation that we will be going off of. Okay. So the reason that I chose the title Rethinking Priorities is because I think a lot of the information that I'm going to share with you this afternoon is probably going to sound really radical and completely outside of what I think we've all come to understand as normal, traditional, expected. So you might be a little taken back by some of the things in this workshop today, but I think that there's also room to sort of customize, to pick things that you feel would be applicable to your classes, things that you might have been thinking about before. And like me, I kind of felt like I needed permission from Eurist and my boss to do some of these things. So hopefully that is something that you're able to get out of this workshop today. So Dean McCrow will be giving an introduction. After that, we will get into sort of the meat of the workshop. This workshop is heavily influenced and informed by a book called Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. I included the bibliographical information at the end of the slide. So if you want to pick that book up, the information is there for you to find it. I highly recommend it. It's such a valuable resource. I don't feel like I was able to really fit everything I wanted to from the book into this workshop because we only have about an hour, but I would definitely recommend, if this is something that you're really interested in, to picking that book up. So there are three main pillars. I'll introduce those, introduce some actionable and cultural changes that might increase equity in classrooms. And then we'll do the reflection portion, which will be very interactive on your half. And then I'll answer any questions at the end of that. So I will turn it over to Dean McCrow. Rich.
Hi. Oh, me. Okay, everybody can hear me now. Good deal. This is an introduction for me also in this topic, but I am extremely passionate about changing the way we think about assessments in the sense of how we look at students and what happens in the classroom. So hence the title of the presentation is Grading for Equity and Rethinking Priorities and Approaches to Student Assessment. I firmly believe that the way we assess students truly impacts their learning. And it sounds logical enough, but you would be surprised at others that don't think that way. That learning has already happened, so let's assess and make it. But I think that when a student's looking towards, let's say, a final exam, how they learn moving towards that final exam impacts the learning that actually takes place. Let's go to the next slide. And for everybody that knows me knows that I always make sure to get my granddaughter in the picture. So I'll give you a moment to look at this picture because it'll be the core of my introduction. And as you look at the picture, I want you to look at how you think learning is taking place here, both from my son, her father, and my granddaughter. And for those of you who don't know, I know there's, I see quite a few psychology folks here, so they definitely know this, but at 2 years old, 2-year-olds have twice as many synapses as adults, which means that they learn the fastest at this stage in their life than they will at any other time in their life. And so how would you assess this learning? I'm thinking a good multiple choice exam on how to pop bubbles. Maybe have her write a term paper on the reason bubbles float and pop. But truly, if you look at this picture, we know that learning is taking place. And so, but there's a lot of joy in learning. And I think that it is my opinion that assessments at sometimes when we give exams can sometimes squelch some of that joy. Not all the time, but often student stress and things that are associated with high stakes exams. You know, if a final exam is 100 points out of 200 for the whole semester, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of joy. And I think back on my college experience, and I don't recall having a lot of joy during finals week or midterms or when I'm writing a paper. And it's crunch time and I have to get it done. And something was lost for me. I did learn, but something was lost for me, because when I think about my college experience, I do think about the times where I had conversations with the instructor, both in the class and outside of the class, where I had the chance to listen to experiences of instructors and learn from what their experiences and bounce my own experiences off what they had learned throughout life and in the subject matter. And that is the information that I retain the most. I'll be quite honest with you, when it comes to final exams and high stakes, papers that I wrote, a lot of the information that I put in there, I don't recall, but I do recall that information when it was lower stress and I was able to enjoy the learning that was taking place. With that, when you talk about joy, a lot of instructors, when they look at final exams and assessments, look at it as a form of authority. This is the authority the instructor has over the students to apply grades and assess the learning and those types of things. And I really do believe that no matter how you choose to grade and assess students, that losing that sense of authority over the student is something that is important, so that it will make your life easier as you're grading papers and going through, because that authority is what sort of weighs you down. If you think that you have this role as an authoritarian over the students, and that may be challenging you when it comes to assessments. And so I ask that you would drop that sort of authoritarian type of approach to these things and look at your students more in this sense, as you're looking at my granddaughter there and laughing and thinking about the joy that you can bring into a student's life. I think it is important for instructors to be actively engaged with their students and learning about their students and talking to them. Knowing their lives outside the classroom, I think, is important to learning. Understanding your own biases when it comes to students, and also student biases towards the instructor, and having conversations about the differences between the two. I will say that and we all have those instructors that were extremely passionate that we remember, and passion is contagious. And if you're passionate about your subject area and you're passionate about your teaching, that passion is infectious to students, and that develops a passionate student. And a passionate student is a student that learns, and they own their own learning. And so as you listen to different strategies that different instructors have to present, think of that passion and make, possibly changes in your own style of learning. A lot of times we're set in stone about the way we went through college and the things that happened to us in college, and we think that's the standard. But truly, there may be a chance to improve and make some changes. I do also say to instructors, the sage on the stage approach. Many of us already realize that just getting up and lecturing students outright is not the most effective way of learning. And so you may want to reserve that for a time where a good lecture is something that the students need, but incorporate into your tradition of a classroom that interaction with the student, and bringing back some of that joy that you're looking at in this picture, so that the student has the opportunity to feel good about learning. I mean, in every subject area, there is joy, and especially when students are working within their major, something they chose to go after. I think that students find joy in that, and that is your chance to leverage their passion for a subject and move forward and present things with a sense of humor and a sense of enlightenment, but at the same time, students can actually be happy about the things that they're learning about. And that I also say that knowing, just having confidence in who you are as the professional expert within your own classroom, because your confidence is going to spill over into the students' confidence and actually build their sense of well-being. So my introduction to this presentation really is about changing the way and looking at ways that you might assess students. It is very well may bring greater joy into your classroom and give you a chance to feel better about what you're doing in the classroom, and may even make life easier for you. So with that, I ask that you listen very closely to what Professor Carrasco has to say, and maybe incorporate some of her strategies into your own classroom, or at least talk through the strategies with some of your colleagues. And with that, I turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you, Rich. Okay, so becoming equity-minded is sort of the first step. One of the things that I realized through my experience was I'm going to admit something here. Like, I'm a very sensitive person. I'm just a soft heart. My skin is not thick, and so I was really nervous about grad school because, you hear all these horror stories about how hard it is and how, everything has to be done perfectly, or, you're going to get kicked out because you're not smart enough. And so I was a little bit nervous, but I ended up in this incredibly empathetic and nurturing and supportive program that really helped me grow as a scholar, as an activist, as a person. And so I think, I had a really hard time in undergrad, but when I still wanted to be an educator. And so when I went through my graduate program, I realized I want to be like this. This is the type of atmosphere that I want to cultivate and maintain in my classes. And so I always say I'm a human first and a professor second, and my students are humans first and students second. And I think sometimes that empathy is missing. And it's something that I think, and there was a quote in Feldman's book that really stuck out to me when he was talking about our suspicion, or about cheating, or students not being motivated. And he just posed the question, why are we suspicious of our students? Why do we come in with this mindset that maybe they're trying to cut corners, that they don't want to be there? And why is that our mindset, and what does that do when we start from that place? And so a lot of it does come down to just being stressed out. School is, it's a big responsibility, and so of course there's going to be some sort of stress factor. But I have this quote from another sort of scholar and educator that I really admire, Zaretta Hammond, who is the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, where she does really connect the neuroscience behind learning. And she's constantly advocating for a high trust, low stress atmosphere, because that's when we're going to get the most out of our students. That's when they're going to be able to live up to their full potential. And so, how do we do that? How do we create trust between us and our students? And how do we create an environment in a classroom where they want to be there every week and they can't wait to learn because they know that the stakes are low? It's not a life or death situation. They do have that capacity for joy and to enjoy expanding their knowledge. So with that in mind, grading is probably one of the biggest stressors for both of us, for the students and for the professors. And so, how do we change the way that grading looks to make it more equitable, but also to make it maybe a little bit more low stakes, or not as stressful as it traditionally has been? So the three pillars of equitable grading are accuracy, bias resistance, and intrinsic motivation. So these are the three things that your assessment should be focused on in your students. Points should not be used to reward or punish students for behavior or any sort of the soft skills that they're bringing in. Grading should not reflect our own biases. It should not reflect our understanding of the subject matter. I think we all know that I think across any discipline, you have various theories and various approaches to the material. And so to say that the one that we've adopted or the one that we've sort of bought into for ourselves is the only right way is not really giving our students a chance to explore that subject in a way that might make more sense to them. So just looking at what the three of these mean separately. So obviously accuracy is that it's mathematically fair, that it's reflecting specifically of that student's individual performance. It should be assessing their acquisition of knowledge throughout the semester, not the way that they've behaved, not their attitude, not your personal feelings about them. But we also need to remember that more math doesn't always equal more objectivity. I know, especially for most of us, we use just whatever's in Canvas to keep track of our grades. And, but those algorithms are still created by humans with biases. And so just because we try to sort of maybe take the human factor out of our grading, it doesn't mean that it's more accurate or it's more objective. And so looking at the way that we do the math is kind of part of it as well, and not just like, throwing some things into a grade book and saying, well, whatever number comes out, that's pretty accurate because the computer did it. Intrinsic motivation, I think that this is incredibly important for students pursuing higher education. I always tell my students, you're here because you made the choice to be. It's not the law that you're in college. So take ownership over your education. But also we need to be understanding of, especially I think at a community college, that we have a variety of students that are starting their journey at BC for various reasons. And some of those reasons might be some deficiencies in some skills. It might be emotional maturity, or it might just be like a financial reason. So we need to look at the way that students are motivated and make sure that that motivation is, I don't want to say pure, but maybe well-intentioned, because on one end, you'll have students that get discouraged because maybe they're not keeping up with class at the same pace as their classmates. But that doesn't mean that, everything's not going to click by the end of the semester. I've definitely had those moments as a student where I felt like I was struggling and drowning. And then, the last 3 weeks, everything just sort of started to make sense for me. So making sure the students are able to hold on and continue through that process and not being discouraged by what their grades look like. As long as they are kind of feeling like they're making progress, like we should encourage them to continue on. But at the same time, I think we all have had experiences with students that only care about their grade. And it's not really about retaining that knowledge. It's about, what do I have to do or say in my papers or in class for participation grades to make sure that my teacher is giving me the most points possible. And so having this tunnel vision towards a high score and not actually like growing in your knowledge of that subject is also a problem. I think sometimes we see students with like the A's and the B's and we think they're fine, but how much learning is really going on there, or did they just learn how to kind of game the system? And then bias resistance is definitely like the most internal work. This is the place where we really need to be focusing on ourselves and not so much the classroom and our students. And we don't really have control over the social conditioning of biases, but we can correct those once they're recognized in us. And so this is something that, especially when it comes to student behavior or like attitudes that you might feel, some type of way about, and let's dig into that. Why do you feel that way, and what is that really? What are the implications for that when it comes to the student's grade? Okay, so in terms of the mathematically accurate, one of the things that Feldman has a really big problem with is the 1 to 100 percentage scale. I took this little chart here straight from the book. He feels like it emphasizes failure over success, and there's so many little fine, gradations in there that a student might not understand why they got a 76 instead of an 82, and it might even be hard for you to explain if that question comes up. So what he proposes is sticking with the 0 to 4 scale, even for individual assignments. It's simpler to understand, it's less prone to error, and it's more oriented towards success. So you can see from the scale, with the 1 to 100 scale, over 60% of that scale represents a failing grade. Whereas with the 0 to 4, only 20% of the scale is kind of a message to the student that there's not satisfactory progress happening. And then it kind of trickles up, I guess, into, what's meeting standards or exceeding standards, where in the 1 to 100 scale, that's only 21% of, the possible scores. But then with the 0 to 4, it's 40%. So you can already see how numbers wise, if a student is looking at their grade on Canvas, that one of these would probably be more discouraging than the other. Okay, so actionable changes. These are things that can really help foster that intrinsic motivation that is really important for students at this level in their education. So another quote, I'm a really big fan of quotes. I don't know if you've noticed that yet. This is from Dr. David Bowles, who is an educator at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And his quote is, "Students are acutely aware of injustice and by nature rebellious against the systems of authority that keep autonomy away from them." And I think this really does echo what Rich said earlier about, being an authoritarian in the classroom and that natural sort of instinct of the students to maybe react negatively towards that type of attitude. So how can we change? How can we become not only more equity minded when we're assessing our students, but also what the relationship that we have as instructors with our students? And so these are some of these I have all been implementing in my classes. Some of them I'm still sort of negotiating what that would look like for me, but student-centered grading policies is kind of a step away from the traditional kind of like, I'm the authority, I get to say, I choose your fate type of approach to grading. So some of the, the measures, I guess, that I've taken in my classes and what they look like. So the first one is, this is probably the most crazy one for most people to hear. No due dates. I do not have due dates in my classes for any of my assignments. And this freaks students out on the first day when I tell them this, because they immediately feel lost. And that is because they don't know how to self-regulate. They don't have any confidence in their ability to manage their own time and their workload. But I think that is such an important skill for them to learn. So I force them to do it. I don't take off points for late submissions because I want to wholly assess their quality and their ability to demonstrate their knowledge. I don't care. I would rather read a paper that's 3 weeks late and is just absolutely excellent than read a paper that was turned in at 11:58 p.m. on the due date, a day that it was due, and it's full of grammar mistakes and it's just incoherent. And it's just very obvious that that student was in a mad panic to turn something in so they didn't get punished. One of the things that I have found is helpful is I give a suggested due date. So it's sort of, just a suggestion, a soft sort of due date to say, I think it's reasonable if you want to kind of have a guide to how you want to manage your time or your workload, try to have it in by this date. And what I have found, I've been doing this for 3 years, the majority of the students will get their work in within 10 days of that soft due date. You don't have a ton of students that wait to the last minute. And then you have this huge grading pile the last week of the semester. But this really did take me having faith in my students that they wanted to be there and they wanted to get their work done and they wanted to learn. So again, I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't, coming in with this idea of all students are lazy. So if I say no due dates, none of them are going to do the work on time. This might look different and depending on what your class is. I think with sociology, everything sort of blends together. So there's not a sequential necessity in terms of the material. So it works for me with my subject, but that might look different for you in a different subject. Let students choose assignments for detailed feedback, either written feedback or office hours. So, going on the 0 to 4 scale or like complete and incomplete, oftentimes my assignments are pretty easy. Again, sociology allows space for a lot of personal reflection. And so I try to give pretty simple assignments that are just reinforcing the lesson. And so I don't feel the need to give a lot of feedback on every single assignment. But, obviously the students don't want to feel like they're in the dark. They don't want to feel like you're ignoring them. And so I usually let them know, if you're worried about, if you did something right, send me a message, add a message to, Canvas notes in the submission and say, hey, can you look this over and let me know how I'm doing? And this works both ways. Sometimes you'll have students who trust you and they're open to that vulnerability of you giving them the suggestion on how to improve. But at the same time, sometimes you have students that just want that pat on the back. They're really proud of something they did and they want to hear that from you. And so, sometimes the assessment, giving it to them in their own hands is helping them get what they need from you, whether it's a direction or some sort of suggestions, or sometimes it is really just like your vote of confidence. And so I don't spend a ton of time grading because sometimes I am just looking to see if they did the assignment and they did it correctly. But when they do want that extra feedback, I'm there and I'm ready to give it to them. Offer end of the semester reflection instead of extra credit assignments. Feldman, again, is really critical of extra credit. He thinks it sort of disrupts this process of, what's important and how work should be managed. So what I usually do is offer the students a chance to just very personally sum up their experience in over the course of the semester. And so I usually pose about 3 or 4 questions that help them get started with the paper. But I always notice sort of halfway between the paper, halfway through the paper, they start kind of going off in their own direction. And, they'll start talking about, again, this is, I think, pretty sociology specific, how they started seeing how everything kind of influenced each other when, we're talking about race and class and sexuality and gender and how, it all kind of makes sense, and how sociology gave them tools and words and understanding of what's happening in their life. And, some of the other questions I pose is, what was the most challenging part of the semester? What assignment did you enjoy the most? And so just giving them the space to reflect on their experience. Sometimes they have this sort of light bulb moment where they're like, oh, wow, I actually learned a lot this semester and maybe I didn't realize it. So I offer this instead of extra credit. It's usually not a mandatory assignment, but most of the students usually end up doing it because they do, I guess, like the opportunity to say, hey, I learned a lot. Allowing students to demonstrate comprehension through non-written methods. This might be tricky in, it's like English composition, but, I think there is a precedent for this. We do oral examinations in grad school, but why is that a method that's wholly just reserved for that level? So it's not something that's always available. It's not something it's not a first option, but sometimes I think there are circumstances where a student is able to articulate their knowledge in a lot more efficient way than writing a paper. And so sometimes, that could be something that is considered in certain circumstances. Abandoning the bell curve and score averaging. So the bell curve is really making education competitive. It's saying, you know, I only have a certain amount of A's and B's to give out, and the rest of you are going to kind of fall somewhere in the middle. And you know, assessment should be wholly individual to that student and their progress, and not have any sort of influence or connection to the rest of the class. And then with score averaging, I think most of us expect our students to improve over the course of the semester, you know, as they're starting to understand the information and the concepts a little bit more. So, you know, if they do really poorly at the beginning of the semester, but like are continuing to improve, they shouldn't be penalized for that early stage where they're sort of just still trying to figure it out. So averaging the scores across the whole semester is sometimes detrimental and doesn't really reflect the true progress that that student has made. And, you know, I used to get a little nervous because every once in a while I'll notice that a lot of students are getting A's and B's in my class. And then I thought, you know, is something off with my rigor? Is, you know, Rich going to call me into his office and be like, what are you doing? Like, what is going on in your class? This doesn't seem right. But A's aren't currency. They don't, you know, the value doesn't decrease if from inflation. And so, you know, another quote from Feldman's book was, the bullseye on a target does not get smaller as more people hit it. So, you know, I think there might be a hesitation to give out a lot of A's, but you know what, if all those students earned A's, then, you know, what's the problem? Let them have the A's. It's not going to decrease the value of an A if 90% of your class passes. And then abolish or redesign exams and quizzes as an evaluation tool, especially to discourage cramming, because I think we all know, and there's a ton of research and science out there, that cramming is a really negative part of education. It doesn't do anyone any favors because it's not a sustainable way to retain knowledge. Okay. Soft skills should be built in students, but they shouldn't be assessed. They shouldn't be part of the grading, you know, policy that you have. But, you know, the way that you design course activities and assignments, and even the way that you structure the class, whether it's lecture, group work, or whatever, should be building these soft skills in students. Again, I think it's really important for students at the community college level that are just starting out on their journey as well, because they're going to be much more successful when they, you know, whether they transfer to maybe a more rigorous university, or even if they just go out into the workforce, having soft skills is going to be beneficial to them. So fostering resiliency and promoting a low stakes learning process inspires enthusiasm. Encouraging transparency and self-advocacy is a stress reducer. Designing activities with no competitive undertones really allows for true peer collaboration, and supporting that intrinsic motivation and self-regulation helps the student build autonomy. That is something that is going to carry on with them and be beneficial throughout their life. Okay, so cultural changes. This is work that we need to do inside of ourselves, and that will help us hold ourselves accountable for implicit biases. So again, of course, another quote, but this one I think is really, really important, and it really does sum up the way that implicit bias works. So I am not responsible for my first thought, but I am responsible for my second thought and my first action. And I think that is something that we need to be constantly like checking in with ourselves about, you know, at the beginning of a semester when we have a new group of students that we are working with. So implicit bias does show up in grading. Again, whether we think about it or not, you know, there's a lot of various identities that we come across as educators at a really diverse school like BC. And so, you know, are any of these factors really influencing the way that we assess a specific student? And if so, you know, where is that coming from, and how can we correct it and make sure that our grading practices are just and equitable? Okay, so some habits to recognize and break that especially are dealing with our implicit bias or just sort of our conditioning or our understanding about education. And a lot of this list I've adopted from the work of Dr. Danica Harris, who is a psychologist in Dallas, and she specifically does work in the area of trauma. And so, you know, academic trauma is, I think, something that has starting to get more attention in terms of research. It's a place where my research lies, but I think it's sometimes people hear that and they think it sounds a little bit ridiculous. So, you know, what is that and what does it look like? So the first one is faculty modeling poor self-care while critiquing students for poor self-care practices. You know, again, we're human first and educators second, and they're human first and students second. And so we need to take care of ourselves and we need to set that example. One of the things that I do is I build a self-care day into my syllabus. And that's sort of intentionally letting the students know that on this day, I'm not doing anything. So if you email me, I'm not going to answer you because I need a break. I need to take care of myself. I need to recharge. And I'm giving you permission to do the same because I care about you as a person and I'm not concerned about your grade at this point in time. Take care of yourself and everything else will fall into place. The hypocrisy of how and when students can use hardship narratives to their advantage. This one is probably the one I have the biggest issue with because I don't think it's talked about enough. And I think because it's happening in sort of two separate areas, that connection's sometimes not made when we're thinking about this. But think about all the times you've had a student who maybe hasn't turned work in on time or has missed a lecture and they email you or they come up to you and they say, I wasn't able to do this because I had to babysit my younger siblings, or I had to pick up a shift at work, or I couldn't make it to class because you know, the bus was running late and I couldn't, you know, get here on time. And we usually, you know, sometimes professors will say, well, that's not an excuse. You know, if your education is important to you, you'll find a way. But at the same time, when it comes to applying for special programs or it comes to applying for scholarships, what do? We always want the students to tell us the saddest story possible. They want us to tell us how hard it's been for them to continue their education and why they should be rewarded with assistance. And that definitely is sending a contradictory message to the students of, you know, what and how their personal experience is allowed to affect and influence their education. So, you know, if a student is vulnerable enough to say, I'm sorry I couldn't do this, I wanted to, but, you know, life gets in the way, I think we should be a little bit more understanding about that, because I think we've all probably been in those types of situations ourselves. Value placed on production and achievement over personal growth. Again, I know we have SLOs, but you know, is there some one narrow path to learning? And, you know, do we care more about the students just turning in work than we do about, you know, how much they're actually learning from that work? Statements like, this is how we've always done it. I think as educators at this level, we don't get that rigorous like pedagogical training that K through 12 student or educators do. We kind of just have a mastery of our subject and then we're expected to figure out a way to pass that knowledge on. And so, you know, a lot of us just revert back to, well, this is how it was when I was in school, or I remember my professors doing this, so I guess that's just the way it works. But again, you know, what did those procedures or policies or ways of doing things make you feel? Was it stressful? Was it you know, something that you don't really remember anything from that class because you were just so scared of your instructor? And so thinking about, you know, how can we break cycles that maybe aren't really serving a productive purpose for growth and learning anymore? Faculty upholding one right way of doing things. I think we live in a world now where we really see a lot of successful people being people that kind of found their own way of doing things, that kind of broke the mold to make themselves stand out. And, so if we're preparing students for the quote unquote real world, then we should be celebrating that sort of innovative thinking. And if that innovative thinking looks different than how we do things or how we understand things, that shouldn't be something that we're scared of or worried about. And prioritizing rigor over the student well-being. Again, low stress, high trust. If your student has anxiety about when they hear your name, how much are they really getting out of your class? And, is that an effective way to educate? Okay, so we're perfect on time. We have a couple little exercises here. So at this time, I would love if you would participate. So I can only see my screen right now. But once I share some of the way that we're going to do these little exercises, I would love for you to just chime in if you have some thoughts or something you'd like to share. So the first one is kind of a little practice on how we might deal with different types of students and assessing growth and understanding of the subject, sort of maybe in a vacuum for those students. So this is a real life example of something that happened to me a couple semesters ago. I teach Sociology B28, which is the sociology of gender. And so I had two students in this class, and this is all real life stuff that happened in that class. So Ethan and Eddie. Ethan was a gay trans man of color. He was open. He had already started his sort of medical transition. And because of that, he had spent years of his life, educating himself, going onto YouTube and Twitter and things and finding information about LGBTQ2 spirit, experiences and trans rights and all of these things, because he needed it for his own understanding of himself and his safety, and for people around him to understand him. Ethan was in the class because he was a sociology major, and obviously it was part of his degree pathway. So he was really excited and wanted to be there. Eddie, on the other hand, was a straight cis man of color. He had really traditional values, and early on in the class, he did express some homophobic and misogynist opinions. Not in a violent way, but I think it was still pretty shocking for most people in the class to hear him be so upfront about, how he felt about certain issues. He was, I think, like an industrial science major, but he was in the class because it fulfilled a GE requirement. And he actually joined the second week because he had two friends that were in the class, and I had a couple extra seats left open. And so they convinced him that, he should just be in the class with them. So during class, both of them came to class almost every time. There are very minimal absences from both of them. What I noticed, though, was a lot of the more basic kind of foundational assignments and readings that I was assigning, Ethan didn't do it. He just didn't care. He felt like it was a little bit below him. He already knew about it. So he would still come to class and contribute information that was relevant, but I always noticed it wasn't from the actual reading that was assigned. And he also didn't turn in assignments that went along with those readings. And I think it was just a matter of boredom or just feeling like it wasn't important. Eddie did do the readings, and he would come to class with questions. Sometimes the questions, I think the way he worded them came off as offensive, but the intentions were, I really don't understand this, but I am open to hearing about it. Can you please explain this to me? And so, the capacity for changing his opinions was there. And he was doing a lot of that work himself. It was just a matter of if me and sometimes his classmates were going to meet him halfway. At the end of the semester, I had them do these sort of like bigger reflection papers. They were able to choose any topic they wanted that we had sort of touched on during the end of, throughout the semester. Ethan wrote a really high quality research paper, obviously kind of was probably more like demonstrating like the level that he was at. And he did express a lot of interest in some of the more difficult theoretical readings that I had assigned that some of the other students actually had trouble with. So one of the things that came out of this class was Ethan became really fascinated with Foucault and his work and wanted to, came to my office and said, "Can you tell me where I can find more of this type of reading?" So I did see growth there, but maybe it didn't happen in the path that I had laid out. Eddie, on the other hand, did not complete a research paper. He couldn't figure out what he really wanted to focus on at the end of the semester. But I remember, I think it was the very last day of class, he just kind of openly said, "You know what, when I came in this class, I'm going to be honest, I thought feminism was bullshit. But now after I've heard my classmates talk, I've read these things, I've watched these videos, I kind of feel bad for women. They don't deserve all this crap they're getting. I see the point." And so, he was able to demonstrate growth. He held himself accountable for a lot of the problematic things that he had said and believed at the beginning of the semester. But he did have a pretty big chunk of assignments that were missing. So then I had this dilemma of, these are two very different students. I feel like both of them got something out of the class, but how do I assess them? So kind of my question that I'm posing to you just from this little information on this chart, I guess my first question would be during the first couple weeks of class, what do you think your biases would be towards these two students? So anyone that would like to kind of chime in.
For me, my bias would be that Ethan would be very active in the class and want to do all the assignments, and that Eddie would probably just sit in the back and avoid participating whenever he could.
They actually, both of them, it's so funny. They both sat in the front of the class and they sat next to each other and they became friends throughout the course of the semester. And not once did I ever hear Eddie say anything transphobic or even misgender Ethan.
Well,
And so it was so interesting. And I think sometimes there is that disconnect of, I'm cool with this guy, but the idea of trans people freaks me out and I don't like it.
yeah.
So, what do you do? What would the process be there of having growth maybe happening outside of your syllabus? Any other thoughts?
Nicole, there's a comment in the chat room and it says, "This is why I use points," from Julie Lowe.
Okay. Would you be more hesitant to give Eddie points if he is participating? So for example, if you're using participation points, if Eddie's in class and he's right in front and center and he's raising his hand every question or contributing to every conversation, but he's not saying something that you want to hear, how do you use those points?
It depends. I mean, does it show that he has actually read the material and is tying it back to what he's saying, or is he just jumping off something and then immediately trying to express his homophobic and misogynist opinions?
Okay. Yeah. So, like I said, he was open to listening to different perspectives. He was holding himself accountable when he was changing his mind. So, I mean, at the end of the semester, when it comes to the final grade, is there, does it make sense to be assessing these two students on the exact same scale by the exact same standards?
I know you want us to say that it doesn't, but it's hard for me to wrap my brain. I mean, I get where you're coming from.
Uh-huh.
I get that Eddie is growing in his own way. I get that. However, he didn't complete the research paper. I think it's fantastic that he's showing growth in his own way. And I think that he could write the research paper showing his own growth. I would not expect his paper to be the same as Ethan's.
Mhm.
I wouldn't expect for both men to get the same grade, final grade for the class, because, well, I don't know, for me, they have to show me that I don't have to agree with everything they say,
Mhm.
to show me that they're doing the reading and actively participating. They don't have to agree with it. They can have a different opinion than mine, but they have to back it up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and no, and then I think that what this is I don't have a set expectation of what you're answering. I think one of the things that I experienced and why I wanted to use this example was there is a dilemma when one of the things about having the structure is it kind of does make our job easier. Again, like when we just kind of put the scores into Canvas and let it spit out a final grade for us, that kind of takes some of the responsibility off of us. And now we have this sort of like, sometimes it becomes a dilemma of, I don't want to fail Eddie because I do think he demonstrated growth. Does he deserve an A because he said feminism is okay by the end of the semester? No, of course not. But also at the same time, does Ethan deserve a C because some of these smaller assignments where, he didn't demonstrate the growth because maybe he was focused on something else. Does Ethan deserve a C? Or how easy is it for him? How much should I consider the fact that he is bringing in a ton of like lived experience knowledge that I didn't really have any sort of like platform to assess?
Right. I don't know that I would give him credit for the lived experience knowledge. I would certainly give him credit for actively participating in class. And if he's not going to do every assignment, I think it's okay for him to show that he has that knowledge and not necessarily complete that assignment. I think that you can set up those pretty easily, especially if he's bringing in outside information or if he wants to expand on a different article. I think he's the one you said that wanted more research and more information. And so what I might do is then change some of his assignments. Like it doesn't have to change for the whole class, but this student is at a different level. And so I would allow him to work at that level.
Okay. Yeah, I really like that suggestion. I think that does make sense. I don't know what it's like. I'm assuming it's probably very similar across disciplines, but I think we do get this really wide range of knowledge and student like capabilities coming in. And so I think the challenge sometimes is finding that middle ground where we're not leaving students behind, but students that might be a little bit more advanced are still being challenged or introduced to new ideas. And that's something, especially in my gender class, that I have found really challenging because I think without fail, every semester, I have a trans student. I have a student that identifies as queer or non-binary. And so they've done a lot of this work. But then I also have students that don't understand that there's a difference between gender and sex. And so, how do I catch that middle space where, all these really basic concepts are getting explained to people that don't understand them, but at the same time, people that have a lot of knowledge coming into the class are challenged, are introduced to new ideas. And so, how do we find that middle ground? But then also, how are the students properly assessed from their starting point that might look different from their peers?
Also, Nicole, because this is a general education requirement that probably doesn't have a prerequisite to it, I would think that a level playing ground would be whether someone has a lot of knowledge, prior knowledge, or is just barely coming in to explore. They should be treated on the same level. And I know as an instructor, we do want to look and we want to encourage those that have prior learning to go a little bit further. But with a general education course, that prior knowledge is wonderful to have, but we also just have to assess what they're submitting and their initiative. And it's a little different, I think, than when a student is already in the major and they're taking their kind of basic lower core foundation courses, because we want to see a lot more growth than we probably would when they're taking a general education course and kind of exploring that major. Might even be an undecided student, undeclared, and it's just seeing if it's going to spark some interest. Just like Eddie wasn't a sociology major.
Yeah.
And that's all.
What do you think the challenge, like just knowing just this minimal information that I gave about Eddie, what is the challenge that you would have foreseen if you had a student like this within the first 3 weeks? You know, I think that I definitely had times where I was sitting in class and I was like kind of wishing that he would just drop. Because it would have made my life easier if he had. And that did require me checking myself and saying, you know what, if he shows up to class, I'm going to assume it's because he wants to learn. So what's the process look like in that way to sort of do that? Yes.
I would just say that since he openly expressed homophobic and misogynist opinions right out at the forefront, that I would just be worried that he'd set a negative culture. Because I've noticed that, like, for instance, I had a class where a student had just kind of a funnier sounding name. It was kind of like bouncy, rhythmic-y sort of a name, you know, and a student would go like, ah, you know, and I think that overall, like, immediately had a negative effect on how everyone performed, just by sort of having a bully in the room. So I would just be a little apprehensive about that effect coming out the gate.
Yeah, this class definitely has a lot of safety issues. I think it is a place where a lot of, vulnerability kind of happens because it does get personal sometimes for some of the students because of the nature of the material. And so, yeah, it was hard. I think because he seemed willing to back down when he was called out, it kind of helped me ease my fears about him being in the class. But it did feel like for a while this very fine line of, is this a toxic environment that he's creating, or do I need to give him the grace to hold himself accountable, to learn and to correct maybe some really misinformed, I think is probably the best way to describe where he was coming from with his views. But yeah, it was work on my part to check that and be like, I can't kick him out. I can't. He hasn't done anything to warrant that. He just gets on my nerves sometimes. So, how do we handle that? And what is, again, my second thought and my first action when I'm coming against a student like that? This probably isn't as much of an issue in, say, math, but, we might still have that same sort of like gut reaction to certain students and their demeanor. Okay.
I've got some questions or comments in the chat room.
Mm-hmm.
From Angela, she said, I guess it would be difficult to say that they were grading equitably if we don't use the same metrics. And then I want to go right into Brent's comment of, sounds like there should be a portion of the grade related to the affective domain, values and characterization to assess the growth aspect. The written research paper seems to focus more on the cognitive domain with the understanding and synthesis of the course material. And then there's some more comments about safe spaces that I think we can all agree on. But if you could address those first two.
Yeah, I think that, the metrics laid out in the syllabus, one of the things that I do use a rubric for written assignments and for anything research oriented, because it does kind of give the students that clear direction. One of the things I do notice, though, when I give students academic freedom at this point, it's really distressing for them. And that's one of the things that I'm always trying to address is when I say I expect a research paper at the end of the semester, you get to choose whatever topic you want to write on. Some of the students just get lost with that understanding. They're just like, I don't know how to choose. What do you want me to write on? What do you think is a good paper? And that's what I really am trying to get away from. So, I want to lay out, these are the expectations of the paper. I'm especially really focused on like just mechanics of writing. So, just not turning in a first draft is kind of what I always say. But that freedom to just say like, what interested you the most? We talked about a lot of things this semester. What do you want to know more about for yourself? Go explore that. Here's the framework that I am giving you to like do that. And so, I mean, I think that I want all my students to get the same skills and the same realm of knowledge from my classes, but I kind of have to understand that that's going to look different from person to person. Like I said, I loved reading Ethan's research paper. It was just so amazing. And it was probably more like, upper division bachelor work than, a GE course. But at the same time, someone wrote a perfectly fine paper on, making girls play with Barbies, which is a pretty standard gender studies paper to be written. So, it wasn't as inspired and, it was a little bit tedious for me to read, but at the same time, the mechanics were fine. It was well-researched. They met all the rubric standards that I had set forth. And so, do I give that student a lower grade just because I didn't think that their paper was spicy enough? No, of course not. But at the same time, that might have been something really revolutionary for them to be thinking about. And so acknowledging that is important, I guess. Let me see. Did anyone else have something to say?
No, I was going to say I teach intercultural, so it's intercultural communication. So we're always talking about values, worldviews, and many concepts that people may differ from each other. So one thing that I like to do that I just give full credit for, it's like 5 points, is like journals. Mm-hmm. And I'll give them like a random, like a prompt based on what the lecture is going to be on. So for example, we talk about touch communication. So I'll just ask them, what are your thoughts about touch communication? Are you a PDA person? Things like this, just so they can like write whatever they want. And based on what they write, I kind of know what's coming for the discussion. I can tell like, okay, this person completely disagrees with this. This person understands this a lot more. So I know it's kind of coming when I start lecturing on it and I open the floor for discussions. And as far as, a lot of people are talking about safe spaces, and I completely agree, especially in intercultural, I try to make sure that they all feel comfortable, even if they completely disagree with me. Because I tell my students, you can learn a lot from someone, especially when we disagree, having that like civil discourse, because when we talk about values, we learn that a lot of the things that, we hold near and dear came from something from like 20 years ago, or, from the moment we're taken into a certain school or certain friends or whatever it may be. So that way it also challenged those thoughts and opinions, so that we all understand that we have all these different views, right? And so when I started doing that, I noticed that a lot more people were more open to these discussions. And like I mentioned, even if whatever they write in their journal, I'm like, ooh, this is what we're going to go over, I still give them the full grade, right? Because at least they're giving me, and they feel comfortable enough to tell me how they feel about a certain, subject, and then they feel heard, and then they're more open to listen to others, right? So that is tough, because I also teach a, public speaking course, and when we talk about equity, like I can't give the outgoing professional public speaker an A and then the shy one an F, right? So that's things that I also have to consider is, this person still had the research in there, even if they weren't as loud as the last person. This was still a pretty good, a great speech. If they had that, because let's be real, public speaking is pretty hard for a lot of people, right? So as far as like the research, that I think about that as well. Do you always give the A to the outspoken? And even someone can be super outspoken, but all of their research isn't great, right? So does that mean they get an A just because they weren't nervous? So those are things that I also consider when I'm grading, right?
Yeah, and that's something that Dr. Feldman or Joe Feldman addresses in the book, is that sometimes we have these students that are really pleasant. They're always in a good mood. They seem to get along with everyone. They're just so pleasant to have in class. And that sometimes subconsciously affects the way that we're assessing them. We just assume that they understand everything, or they're making satisfactory progress because they're not visibly stressed out. They're not agitated. They're just nice. They're just such a joy. And so, is that affecting the way that we're assessing them? And are we awarding them points for being outspoken, being happy-go-lucky, and just being a student that's enjoyable to have in class? So I think something that you said really goes along with what Jonathan put in the chat. I think the way safe space shouldn't be like a place where coddling happens. It shouldn't be a place where nobody gets their feelings hurt. I think we need to combat bad speech with intentional speech. And so, if someone disagrees with you, I think getting to the root of that disagreement, and understanding that person's perspective and why they believe that is more important than saying you're being mean, you're being bad, you need to go away, or you need to be quiet. And so that is something that I think needs to happen, as well as well, why do you believe what you believe? Where did you get this information from? Where are these values coming from? And sometimes when you pose those questions to the students, they start doing work and they realize there is no basis for what they're just like, well, I heard it on TV, or it helps me fit in with a certain social group, or that's just what my parents believe. And so it is, I think sometimes when you sort of point out the laziness of that, it really does get them thinking like, oh crap, like, do I really believe this? Like, do I care? Am I invested in this much of this opinion that I'm going to stand up for it? Or do I just like really maybe not understand it as well as I think I did? Okay, so last slide, and this is probably going to be a little bit easier for everyone. Just sort of questions for self-reflection. What outdated and harmful practices am I inadvertently perpetuating in my classes and my grading policies? Which grading practices am I most open to reconsidering? What are my goals for student assessment? And am I more concerned about student learning or their grades? And how am I upholding this objective in my actions? So if anyone would like to answer any of these questions that stick out to you, I would love to continue to hear your feedback on this issue.
One thing I like that you told us was the deadline. I mean, I have assignments that I do have concrete deadlines for, only because like in public speaking, for example, only because we have to get these speeches going. Mm-hmm. But for homework, I just tell them by the end of the semester, all this homework has to be completed, right? And I do that because I taught in Delano for a while, and a lot of my students, and I teach night classes, so a lot of my students are older, they're coming from work, have children, and it's a lot for me to say, all right, all this is due next week. And I noticed that when I started doing, and I'll give them reminders half the semester, like, all right, let's have the first 3 weeks in just so we can start grading. And my homework has gone up a lot more, just because they're like, I have freedom. Like, I now make the time to get this done. And it's nice because, I have weeks where I'm working, the kids are sick or anything like that, and it sucks that I can't get that in and I can't get that grade, right? So that is something that I'm totally keeping, especially now that we're on Zoom and Zoom fatigue, or we're just exhausted.
Yeah.
So it's nice to kind of give them that, at least for homework, right? So that's been working. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's kind of I like the suggestive deadlines, right? But yeah, so that's nice.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Can I just speak a little on that point? So if you're teaching a 5-unit math class, that's so now this is a standard that is never enforced really, but if your class requires less than 240 hours of work from the student, it should be like decredited. And particularly when it comes to math, they don't just happen to do it, and they try to put it off to the last minute. But I totally get what you're saying about this stuff. So what I do is I like to make a syllabus that is kind of a mix, like no late work, but if you like try to get some help, then you could turn it in late, like essentially. So like basically, officially no late work, but then there's actually all these mechanisms where, if it's not going right, then you just have to like show that you're trying or get a little help, and then you could turn it in. It's easy to get around the no late work with just a little something else or something like that.
Yeah. And I think that, like I said, I think this would probably, a lot of these sort of ideas or suggestions would have to be modified for certain like subjects, because I know for math, sometimes you're building knowledge on top of each other. So one has to come before you like move on. And so I think, that would probably look different. What does peer collaboration look like in math? It's not really a discussion-based course like sociology can be. So how do you encourage?
If you're doing it right, it is.
Yeah, but I mean, I think one of the things I noticed and that I kind of like started to consider when I became an educator was all these really cool, fun things that I got to do in grad school that I didn't even know existed or were allowed when I was an undergrad. So why are we, in terms of like collaboration and a lot of academic freedom and, just a lot of things that, we know that we get to do when we're doing graduate work. But it's like, we tell the students at lower levels, well, you're not ready for that. That's not for you yet. And it's like, well, why not? Like I learned so much from being able to sit in class and eat hummus and talk about this book with all of my, my peers. Why can't I do that when I'm in a GE class? Like, I don't understand. I never understood that. And because it didn't make sense to me, I didn't feel like it was necessary for me to uphold it. And so
I agree. And I think that in math, you absolutely can teach it the way we teach graduate classes personally, but that's not the way everyone sees it.
Right. So, I mean, is that a practice that we're perpetuating for no reason, just because that's the way we've always done things? Or is that sort of maybe where the school of thought that we have decided to, base our own personal like research and pedagogy in? And so I think sometimes it's scary for us. Again, I think going back to that idea that we're the authorities in the classroom, it might be scary for us to be a little bit experimental or to try new things because we're the captain of the ship and all the students are expecting us to like know everything and not ever be confused and hold it all together. So, what is the vulnerability capacity on our end of saying, hey guys, I'm trying something new out here, bear with me, but don't worry, because if it doesn't work out, I'm not going to punish you for it. I'm just going to know, maybe this wasn't the best way to go about things. And some students are going to enjoy some things and some students are not going to enjoy it. And so, you can't make everybody happy, but you can try to make sure that everybody's getting as much out of your class as they possibly can.
I do have one comment in the chat room that I want to just mention from Kara McDonald. Her statement is, I'd also add that equitable grading doesn't happen in a vacuum. When paired with other equity initiatives, competency-based ed or credit for prior learning, it solves some of these issues. If students that are already well-versed in the content and have demonstrated the learning already can move forward at a different pace, which is also an equity issue, than those who are less experienced in the content, which would then allow more space to explore productivity versus personal growth in this content.
I agree that equity doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, and is there a way in some of our classes to, you know, I don't want to say treat them as like a TA or anything, but when students do have this kind of more robust knowledge or a stronger foundation, is there a way to tap into that to the benefit of the students that might not get it? So, you know, when it comes, especially to peer collaboration, you know, is there something that we can be doing differently where students are learning from each other and creating an equitable environment for themselves in that way? Because I think that there's sort of levels to knowledge, you know, like there's this level of I have a mastery or like a really strong understanding. And then the next level is, am I able to actually pass this knowledge on? Like, do I understand the mechanisms in which I can get other people to understand what I understand about this subject? And that's sort of like this next level of having a knowledge base. And so can we start fostering that in some of the more advanced students by putting them in a position where they're able to share their knowledge with students who might not be in that same place? Is that an equitable practice?
Nicole, if I understood you correctly, in several aspects you are pointing out the learning experience that has happened not only from the instructor to the students, but you know, between the students itself.
Yes.
So I think that it's important to address, just like Kara, I think, mentioned that some students already come with different level, not because they are already in that major or because they have lived experiences, but maybe they have a genuine interest in that spark that they may pass on to the rest of the students in the class will happen through the discussions that you as an instructor organize or initiate, seeing what the dynamics of the class are once you have probably had the experience on the first and the second week of class. So this is something that, you know, it's probably more of a dynamic process than just stating it in the syllabus. And you're already showing us how of a dynamic and flexible instructor you are with the deadlines. So I think with that liquid aspect of having everyone's input and opinion, and probably even present a section of some of the materials that you already have sensed or you have seen in Eddie or in Ethan, I should say, to participate and find the ownership in the material that he can provide, not necessarily formally as a material, but as a knowledge. It is, to me, a way to show that growth, but also make other people relate and learn from that experience.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you. I don't think it has to be something that is intentionally built into the syllabus. It can be something organic, because you don't always know on that first day or even in the first week what students are coming in with. So when you start, like for the example I gave, Ethan obviously was super passionate about a lot of the issues that we talked about in that class and was more than willing to share his knowledge. And I think it made it really personal for some of the students who may have never known a trans person or who identified as straight and didn't really understand a lot of the social complexities of navigating the world as a queer person. And so I think that passion is contagious. I think sometimes it's less intimidating to learn from a peer in that personal way than it is from, you know, the instructor who I think one of the things that students are maybe intimidated by is that, oh, well, you know, these instructors are so smart, like they know so much about this issue that or this topic that they probably think this little thing that I don't understand is because I'm stupid. It's because, you know, I don't get it. And, I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves where we were at that time and that level and how much growth has happened for us to get to where we are. So I agree that I think that peer collaboration is inspiring enthusiasm, and it's making the learning environment less stressful, maybe even more inspiring. And it should be something that, like I said, it doesn't have to be written into the syllabus. Like, well, I'm going to put you guys in 2 different groups, like, the high group and the low group, and the high group is expected to help the low group. But if it organically sort of emerges in the class, I think that you should embrace that dynamic. Absolutely. And really let the students kind of not only help each other, but kind of take ownership of what they're learning and how they're learning it. Yeah. Were there any of these other questions that anyone had an answer for or wanted to share their thoughts on? We're sort of, I think, over time, so there's no pressure on that. Okay. Well, yeah, I think we've actually gone over time. So if that's all, and there's no more questions. Oh, here's that resource list I did want to give out. So Joe Feldman, this second article is titled When Grading Less is More. It's actually just a blog post on Inside Higher Ed. And it is sort of a couple of professors sharing their experience with kind of experimenting with grading and assignments in a different way, and what that looked like. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is obviously sort of like the Bible for all of this type of stuff. Zaretta Hammond's book has been really interesting for me. And then I'd also like to recommend, when it comes to work in our implicit biases and the ideas of objectivity, Sandra Harding, who is a feminist philosopher that works a lot with the ideas of these. So there's a YouTube link here just for an interview of her talking about her work. But also, if you just Google her name with standpoint theory, strong objectivity, or situated knowledges, some of her articles or books will come up. And I just think it's a really valuable resource to sort of understand how and why people think the way they do, and how and why we see the world the way that we do. So that is just my little sort of starting point to do a little bit more exploration with this this topic. Okay. And that's all I have. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I hope you got some valuable knowledge or ideas out of this, and I would be happy to answer more questions or continue this conversation individually if you have the desire for that.
Thank
All right.
you. Have a great semester.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Great job.
Great job.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. It was a really good session, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
Thanks.
Nicole, my name is Carolyn. Hi.
Hi.
Haven't met yet, but I also teach sociology and some psychology classes. And it's funny, we sound a lot alike. Just say, it's like, oh my gosh, I feel the same way on so many things too. So it's nice to kind of meet you. Thank you so much, Rich and Nicole and everybody. Y'all have a great day, okay?
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Carolyn. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Anita.
Nicole, are you still there?
Yeah, I am.
I'm sending.
I
cut and pasted the chat, and so I'm sending that forward.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess I don't really know what the like recording will look like, and like what's available out after this session. Since I've never done this, so hopefully there'll be the access to some of these resources, and they want to go back and look at something.
All right.
Yeah, Pam will send out have the recordings of all the sessions for you.
Okay. Yeah, and then I know that there's like a feedback form. Do I get that feedback, or
I did put it in the the chat.
Mhm.
Do you want me to put it in there again? I'll put it in there again.
Okay. So if people fill that form out, will I be able to see it? Or
I believe so. I don't see why not. Pam is handling all those. If you want to send Pam Rivers an email,
okay. Yeah.
so I'm sure she'll, yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully everybody filled one out.
Yeah. I mean, I just hope it was fruitful and they don't feel like they wasted their time. So I guess that was,
I think it was
think
very
so.
good.
It was very good.
thank you. I mean, I was
Yeah.
like kind of like watching the faces, and I think some of the things people are like, whoa, no, that's too much for me. I can't do that. And I expected that reaction, because I think some of these things probably do sound very radical. So hopefully, it just got them thinking in a different direction, and they can figure something that works for them out.
Right.
It might not look exactly like the way I do things. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
I
Okay.
think it'll be good. I think they received it well, and you'll see, the chat had a lot of good questions and comments, and I think people enjoyed it. I think it was very productive, and I think you planted some good seeds.